Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're plunging into a topic that's really at the forefront of global conversations: how industries like mining interact with the communities they impact.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And nowhere is that relationship more vital or more complex than when indigenous peoples are involved.
It's a connection woven right through history, often marked by conflict, unfortunately.
Right.
But as we'll uncover, it also holds surprising potential for, well, genuine partnership and mutual benefit.
Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack that intricate relationship between the mining industry and indigenous peoples. We're pulling our insights directly from Dr. Karl-Heinz Spitz and John Trudinger's comprehensive work, Mining and the Environment.
A foundational text for this topic?
Absolutely. We'll explore what effective practices look like, confront the challenges head-on, and maybe reveal those unexpected pathways to shared success.
Historically, mining's interactions with indigenous peoples, or IPs, have been most visible in places like Canada, Australia, the Western USA, and parts of Africa.
Kind of the classic locations you think of.
Exactly. But the global nature of modern operations means these conversations are now happening in many more countries across the world.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. While many indigenous communities face similar issues globally,
There are similarities, yes.
the differences in their cultures, their histories, their local contexts, they're absolutely critical.
Oh, profoundly.
Which means there's no one-size-fits-all prescriptive approach. You simply have to tailor your strategy to the specific situation on the ground.
Which brings us immediately to a fundamental challenge. What exactly do we mean by indigenous peoples? It's a term we use broadly, but its definition isn't always straightforward, is it?
No, not at all. There isn't a single universally agreed-upon definition. Often it refers to the original inhabitants of the land,
Like American Indians or the Dayaks of Borneo.
or Australian Aborigines. And just a quick note our source makes: Koori is actually a specific tribal name in Australia, not a blanket term for all Australian Aborigines.
That's a good clarification. You also hear confusing terms like ethnic minorities or tribals used interchangeably sometimes.
Which just muddies the waters even more.
It really does. If we look at the history, the term is probably clearest when it distinguishes original inhabitants from the populations that arrived after European conquest, particularly in the Americas.
Okay, that makes sense.
Elsewhere, though, the interpretation can vary wildly, leading to complex political discussions about who truly qualifies as indigenous.
So if there's no single crystal clear definition, how do major international bodies like, say, the World Bank navigate this? Is there at least a working consensus that companies can rely on?
There is, thankfully. It's been shaped by institutions like the World Bank, which kind of sets a standard for international finance.
Okay.
They've laid out broad criteria. First, a group identifies itself as a distinct indigenous cultural group, and importantly, others recognize that identity.
Self-identification and external recognition. Got it. Second, they have a collective deep connection, a real attachment to specific lands or ancestral territories and their natural resources.
Not just living there, but a deeper connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Third, their own cultural, economic, social, or political institutions are distinct from the dominant society around them.
Right.
And finally, they often have a unique language or dialect separate from the national one.
Okay, let's unpack that with a powerful real-world example, because this is where the nuance truly comes alive, isn't it?
Definitely.
Our sources highlight a fictional but very realistic mining project in North Sumatra, Indonesia, and the Batak people.
This case perfectly illustrates the complexity we're talking about. The Indonesian government, for instance, identifies some indigenous communities as Komunitas Adat Terpencil,
Which means?
essentially geographically isolated indigenous communities. They base this on criteria like being small, homogeneous, remote, using simple technology, high environmental dependence, that sort of thing.
But then you have the Batak. They're a large, diverse ethnic group, maybe 4% of Indonesian citizens, and certainly not isolated. In their homeland, they represent mainstream society.
So even though some sociocultural scientists, maybe using those international guidelines, might technically categorize the Batak as indigenous peoples,
Right, based on the criteria.
targeting special development or consultation programs just for them could actually create new inequalities for other minority migrant communities living right there in the same region.
It's such a delicate balance. And our material shows that international standards, like IFC Performance Standard 7 often use Indigenous peoples broadly for a distinct, vulnerable social and cultural group. The focus shifts slightly towards vulnerability, not just original inhabitant status.
That makes sense. It's about vulnerability and distinctness.
Exactly. How do you uplift one group without inadvertently sidelining another? It's a constant challenge. And this leads us to a broader picture. The UN estimates over 250 million indigenous people globally,
250 million.
with the vast majority residing in Asia. That's an enormous population with unique needs and, crucially, unique rights.
So why should we as individuals or as a global community genuinely care about these issues? It feels like it's far more than just a nice to have or a box to tick, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The source makes it clear there are truly compelling reasons for deep engagement.
Such as?
Well, the reasons are multifaceted: legal, moral, and perhaps surprisingly, profoundly pragmatic.
Pragmatic, too.
Yeah. Think about the rising global influence. We've witnessed concrete shifts, like the United Nations establishing a permanent forum on Indigenous issues back in 2002,
I remember that.
and the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDREP, being passed in 2007. These aren't just symbolic gestures. They signify a major shift in how the world addresses Indigenous rights.
And it really challenges some long-held assumptions, doesn't it? That traditional Western model of progress.
The idea that financial wealth automatically equals betterment for everyone.
Yeah, that idea. It simply isn't universally applicable anymore, especially not for Indigenous peoples.
Not at all. And this applies to political systems, too. The notion that Western democracy is the only valid political structure. It often overlooks the fact that Indigenous societies have developed incredibly effective systems of their own.
Effective systems.
Yes, and some of these, our material suggests, may be superior to those of the Western world, genuinely offering much to teach us.
That's a fascinating insight, isn't it? To think we might have things to learn from these systems.
It really is. And this naturally connects to a growing global appreciation for Indigenous cultures. There's a popular perception of them as intrinsically ecologically sustainable, living in harmony with traditional livelihoods.
You hear that a lot.
Now, some historical research, like Flannery's work mentioned in the source, points out that not all Aboriginal activities were always perfectly sustainable.
Okay, so it's not a perfect romantic picture either?
No, but there's no denying a powerful and growing appreciation for ancient knowledge. Whether it's the medicinal value of herbal remedies or a profound understanding of complex ecosystems, there is wisdom there that modern society is only just beginning to truly value.
But this isn't just about admiring cultures from afar, is it? It's also about confronting a harsh reality. Profound disadvantage.
And fortunately, yes, most Indigenous peoples live under incredibly difficult conditions, often due to harsh environments, yes, but also marginalization by other cultures, forced displacement.
Think about it. Many non-Indigenous populations have seen continuous improvement in basic human needs: freedom, health, education.
Yeah, a steady upward trend for many.
But for Indigenous societies, however, these benefits have often been agonizingly slow or just non-existent.
Their societies have often been weakened by losing their land, by disease, by exploitation, or even by well-intentioned but ultimately misguided attempts to integrate them,
All of that creates a deep cultural divide.
making these communities incredibly vulnerable. And if we connect this to the bigger picture for mining companies, beyond the moral imperative, there's a stark pragmatic reality.
Which is?
It's simply impossible to operate in the face of sustained community opposition.
Makes sense.
Years of fear and mistrust from past injustices, coupled with deep concerns for culture and identity, can completely overwhelm good intentions, especially when outside anti-mining influences are ready and waiting to exploit these anxieties.
That makes perfect sense. You just can't force it. So let's delve deeper into these Indigenous societies themselves.
Yeah.
Our material makes it abundantly clear that while no two are truly identical,
Not at all.
there's a beautiful tapestry of unique blends alongside some profound shared foundations.
Diversity is absolutely key here. Every community has its own unique character, deeply shaped by its culture and historical experiences.
How do these differences show up?
Oh, in countless ways. Language, belief systems, communication styles, the intricacies of extended family or kinship systems, and their past encounters, often negative with outsiders. And here's a crucial point. These differences aren't just between different communities. They can exist within a single society, too, particularly between generations.
That's an important nuance. So, given that incredible diversity, are there still some crucial commonalities that can help us understand their worldview? What stands out to you as most fundamental?
Without a doubt, the most profound is their close affiliation with the land.
The connection to the land.
Yes. For many, the earth is seen as mother or creator. Individuals and families often have a deep, almost spiritual identification with specific parts of the landscape.
Okay.
And here's the crucial insight from the source. Any damage to or exclusion from that land doesn't just represent economic loss, it results in deep anguish and even grief.
Anguish and grief. Wow.
Because they believe in a direct living relationship between the land and their own well-being.
That's such a powerful distinction from a purely economic or resource extraction view of land.
Yeah.
It shifts the entire perspective.
Absolutely. Other commonalities include internally understood rules and codes of conduct, often oral traditions.
Oh, written down anywhere.
Exactly. You can't just read them in a book, and ignorance of these unspoken rules can cause deep offense. There's also, almost universally, a respected elder leadership structure and a wealth of important cultural and spiritual knowledge passed down through generations, covering everything from survival techniques and resource management to understanding weather patterns and how to conduct oneself with other communities or guests.
That knowledge sounds invaluable.
It is. And nearly universally, there's a strong community memory of historical events, often involving negative experiences with outsiders, ranging from suspicion and mistrust to, sometimes, overt hostility.
With such different worldviews, it seems inevitable that fundamental values will clash sometimes. Our material gives a really vivid example with the work ethic.
Yes, that's a great example. From a typical non-Indigenous perspective, Indigenous peoples might sometimes be perceived as unmotivated or lazy.
You hear that stereotype sometimes.
Unfortunately. However, when you flip that from the Indigenous viewpoint, non-Indigenous people are often seen as preoccupied by work and material benefits, to the exclusion of more important social and spiritual needs.
So it's a complete inversion of values.
Yeah.
A profound misunderstanding rooted in different priorities.
Exactly. And it extends to the very perception of time. Western society often races to the rhythm of time is money, driven by clocks and rigid deadlines.
We live by the clock.
But for many Indigenous cultures, rhythms are tied to nature. The seasons, the weather, the tides. This fundamental difference can lead to immense frustration and misunderstanding on both sides.
I can see that.
For many Indigenous communities, the relentless pursuit of progress, as defined by the developed Western world, is seen as potentially coming at the expense of its soul.
At the expense of its soul. That's powerful.
It raises an important question for all of us, really. Can progress truly be called progress if it dismantles cultural identity, spiritual connection, and traditional ways of life?
That's a deep question.
Yeah.
Ultimately, though, and this is a universal starting point, our material points out that, like people anywhere, Indigenous societies generally desire improved conditions for future generations.
Of course.
And they deserve and absolutely expect respect.
Fundamental respect.
Let's pivot now to the double-edged sword of mining itself. For these communities, what are the genuine potential opportunities it can offer?
On the opportunity side, mining can bring significant benefits. Things like employment, education, tailored training programs.
Real skills, real jobs.
Potentially, yes. It can lead to much-needed improvements in infrastructure, roads, power, water, and better housing, access to medical services, and other community initiatives.
That sounds really positive.
For some communities, especially in remote areas, it might genuinely be the best, perhaps the only means to achieve their aspirations, whether that's improved health, safety, greater independence, or building a vibrant community that keeps young people connected to their homelands.
Okay, that sounds incredibly promising, like a real pathway to development. But what's the flip side? What are the significant perils?
The perils are substantial. There's the potential for irreversible loss of land, widespread pollution, the loss of access to traditional resources like hunting grounds or medicinal plants.
Things they rely on.
Exactly. There's the risk of being overwhelmed by a sudden influx of outsiders, the introduction of new diseases they have no immunity to, and profound, rapid changes in traditional norms and values.
Which could lead to?
All of this can lead to new forms of dependency, a deep sense of loss of identity, and the breakdown of their existing societal structures. It's a heavy price, potentially.
And when it comes to actually sharing the benefits, that's where it gets really complex and often messy, right?
Yep, absolutely. Some Indigenous communities genuinely wish to be left entirely alone, to have no contact.
Just preserve their way of life.
Yes. But most, understandably, seek betterment, although their definition of betterment can vary dramatically from community to community, and certainly from a Western perspective.
And that's where huge disparities can emerge.
Exactly. The benefits derived from mining can create enormous differences even between neighboring groups. Think about North American Indian tribes. One group with rich mineral resources might prosper immensely, while another, just miles away, remains impoverished.
That must create tension.
It certainly can. Our material contrasts this with Australia's land councils, which often try to alleviate this by spreading benefits more broadly across groups. But in other scenarios, like Indonesia before a key law in 1999, national governments claimed all the revenues.
Leaving local communities
With the impacts, but no direct share of the profits.
So a company can find itself in a very difficult position, almost pressured to compensate for what a government isn't providing, even though that's not really their role.
Exactly. It highlights the crucial need for governments, communities, and companies to all be actively involved in shaping these agreements right from the outset. It can't just be one party.
What I found particularly eye-opening in our source material is that the alienation of land or access often emerges as the most sensitive issue.
Yeah.
Why is that? What makes it so paramount?
You have to remember, for many Indigenous peoples, they've already experienced profound losses of their traditional lands over generations.
A history of loss.
What remains may be barely sufficient for their traditional way of life. Land access isn't just about economics, it carries immense cultural, historical, and spiritual weight.
We talked about that grief and anguish.
Exactly. The source cites research highlighting land as a source of well-being, sometimes even physical survival. You have sacred sites, complex, customary land tenure systems.
Systems we might not even understand.
Precisely. And a fundamental understanding that, as the source puts it, Aborigines generally do not regard traditional land as a tradable asset.
Not a commodity.
Not at all. So companies often face the profound decision of whether to simply forego mining an ore body if it's on a truly sacred site, as was the case with one part of the Ranger uranium mine in Australia.
Wow. To walk away from resources because of a sacred site, that's a powerful testament to the land's significance.
It really is.
And that leads us directly to compensation. It sounds straightforward, typically cash for surrendering rights. But for Indigenous peoples, it's often far more complex than just money, isn't it?
Oh, significantly more nuanced. The very concepts of singular ownership and direct financial compensation can be quite alien to some Indigenous societies and easily misunderstood.
How so?
We've seen cases where traditional owners believed they were being compensated for temporary access or usage, maybe for disturbance.
While the company thought,
Well, the company genuinely thought they were paying for a full ownership transfer, extinguishing all prior rights. Huge potential for misunderstanding.
and language, of course, must be a huge barrier here. Imagine trying to translate complex legal property concepts.
Absolutely. Given the cultural differences, varying education levels, and the tendency for non-Indigenous groups to rely on complex legalistic documents, the risk of profound miscommunication is enormous.
So the form of compensation matters too.
Immensely. Cash payments, especially in non-cash economies, have often, as the source notes, led to nothing of lasting value, while at the same time causing social disruption.
Social disruption.
Sudden influxes of cash can lead to alcoholism, gambling, exploitation by outsiders, internal conflict over distribution. It can tear communities apart.
That's devastating.
And past attempts with non-cash forms like housing or vehicles sometimes failed because communities lacked the parts or maintenance capabilities to sustain them long term.
Another major peril mentioned is the uncontrolled influx of people. This sounds like it could create widespread social problems very quickly.
It certainly does. The arrival of large numbers of job seekers, often drawn by the promise of work, can quickly lead to shanty towns springing up around the mine site.
With what kind of conditions?
Often widespread poverty, poor sanitation, the spread of disease, and an increase in crime. This is incredibly damaging to local Indigenous communities who might get blamed or caught in the crossfire.
And companies don't have legal authority over that.
Typically not outside their direct operational area. But they must anticipate this problem and proactively work with authorities to assist in the response, perhaps by sponsoring urban planning initiatives or helping build capacity for local community services to cope with the influx. They can't just ignore it.
And all of this rapid change, the money, the people, the new infrastructure, can profoundly disrupt the very fabric of societal organization within an indigenous community.
It definitely can. Mining activities can drastically alter a community's population composition, for example. A sudden increase in single males looking for work.
Which changes the social dynamic.
Completely. It can exaggerate economic gaps, rapidly creating haves and have-nots, leading to internal conflicts. Outside agencies, government, NGOs, the company itself are introduced. Existing values can erode quickly, and new, sometimes detrimental, values can emerge.
Like accelerated change on steroids.
Exactly. While all societies evolve, industrialization accelerates change at an unnatural, often overwhelming pace, upsetting established community balance and identity. That's why robust social impact predictions are absolutely critical, and they need to be done very early in the planning process.
This brings us to a really poignant issue raised in the material: the potential loss of customary values and cultural identity. These are the very foundation of indigenous societies.
They really are.
And their disintegration can lead to a profound loss of cohesion and purpose.
This is a critical point. Independent and distinct values are incredibly difficult to maintain when modern values, often Western values, become so pervasive through media, contact, economic changes.
It's hard to resist that influence.
Very hard. Some indigenous communities, like those involved in Australia's outstation movement, mentioned in the source, have deliberately sought isolation to protect their traditional values.
Moving away to preserve their culture.
Yes. And it's also crucial, as the source points out, to challenge our own biases in terms like modern versus traditional. Modern often implies desirable or progressive, while traditional can imply archaic or backward.
But that's a value judgment.
Exactly. Our material stresses that it is possible to be contemporary and indigenous at the same time. It's about adaptation on their terms, not assimilation.
So how do companies mitigate this potential erosion of identity? Our sources suggest things like fly-in, fly-out approaches to minimize constant contact.
Yes, that's one strategy, like at the Nabarlik Uranium Project. Equally important are workforce codes of conduct.
Fields of conduct.
Yeah, but crucially, these must be developed in consultation with the affected community. They can't just be imposed.
What might they include?
Things like strict limits on mine workers visiting indigenous communities, restrictions on alcohol or drugs, or prohibiting sexual contact with local people. It's also absolutely vital to implement cultural awareness training for non-Indigenous workers to foster genuine respect and understanding, and to maintain constant dialogue to resolve any grievances before they fester and escalate.
It sounds like mining can also cause significant shifts in decision-making authority within these communities, which must be incredibly disruptive.
It can be profoundly. Traditional authorities like family heads, chiefs, or spiritual leaders whose legitimacy is deeply rooted in kinship and locality can find their status diminished.
How does that happen?
It happens when they encounter outsiders in new situations, like the introduction of addictive drugs or sudden, large amounts of wealth, which aren't covered by their existing customary rules. They might not know how to handle it.
And the company's arrival changes things too.
Yes. The arrival of external powers, whether government bureaucrats or company management making decisions, can inadvertently erode the chief's status.
So what should companies do?
They should be acutely aware of this and ensure that their senior personnel consistently interact directly with established Indigenous leaders, respecting their positions to avoid undermining their authority.
And finally, a very real and perhaps insidious risk you mentioned earlier: inadvertently creating a community that becomes entirely dependent on the mining operation.
This is a huge concern, and one companies need to be constantly vigilant about. A community can become totally reliant, not just for subsistence jobs, income, but even for day-to-day decision-making. The company starts providing everything.
Which sounds helpful, but...
But then, when the mine eventually closes, as all mines do, if they've abandoned their traditional livelihoods, if their own decision-making structures have atrophied, they can be left unable to meet even their most basic needs. It leaves them incredibly vulnerable.
So how do you avoid that dependency trap?
Companies should consciously refrain from making decisions for communities. They need to actively promote self-help and capacity building over simply handing out aid or services. And they should strongly encourage the continuation of traditional activities and livelihoods alongside any mine-related benefits.
That makes so much sense. Keep those traditional skills and structures alive. With all these challenges and opportunities looming, how do you even begin to build the right relationship? Our material is very clear. You have to get it right from the start. First impressions are everything.
Absolutely crucial. Those initial interactions are incredibly difficult to overcome if they go wrong. Getting it right involves deep preparation.
Like what?
Genuinely understanding cultural differences, developing appropriate corporate values that reflect respect, gathering comprehensive information about the specific community, and carefully planning every aspect of your community contact before you make it.
And at its heart, it's about shifting your mindset, isn't it? Moving from viewing Indigenous peoples as a problem to be managed
Yeah, shifting away from that.
to truly treating them as partners. Their lives, their livelihoods, their entire futures are genuinely at stake.
Precisely. Respect becomes paramount, even more so than merely offering compensation, though that's important too.
And a foundational principle here, which I found particularly impactful in our sources, is recognizing that all cultures are valid.
Yes. This is non-negotiable.
Culture is a human construct shaped by unique circumstances, and it creates, as the source says, different versions of reality.
The core truth is, not all people perceive the world and events the same way, yet each worldview is equally justifiable and real.
And the source is blunt. Anyone unable to truly accept this principle simply should not be involved in dealing with Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. It requires a fundamental level of cultural humility and respect.
And our sources outline some common threads that weave through all cultures. Pattern behaviors, shared understandings, the entire sum of ways of living transmitted across generations, essentially, the way we do things around here.
And this leads directly to that growing global appreciation for Indigenous cultures and their vast knowledge we touched on. We see it reflected in World Heritage listings, which increasingly acknowledge traditional cultural values.
Right, it's not just about nature, but culture too.
Exactly. The value of ancient knowledge, like the medicinal effectiveness of herbal remedies or a deep understanding of complex ecosystems, is truly beginning to resonate in modern society. We're realizing there's so much to learn.
So before any direct engagement even begins, a company really needs to look inward and assess its own values. What should they be striving to foster in their approach? What does that look like internally?
They need to cultivate genuine openness, a real desire to understand Indigenous aspirations, a deep appreciation for the coexistence of diverse cultures.
Acceptance, not just tolerance.
Exactly. That includes accepting different traditions, showing profound respect for customary land rights, and truly internalizing that land holds, as the source puts it, irreplaceable totemic, ancestral, religious, and subsistence values. It's not just dirt and rocks.
And to make those values actionable, cultural awareness training must be absolutely essential for staff.
Yes, non-negotiable. It's crucial for helping non-Indigenous people understand Indigenous cultures and, crucially, avoiding misunderstandings that can so easily lead to offense, sometimes unintentionally.
What should that training cover?
Basic protocols for greetings, how to conduct meetings appropriately, maybe even rules around sharing food. Most Indigenous communities, the source notes, are proud of their heritage and often very willing to share it, even assisting in the training themselves.
That's good to hear.
Our sources suggest maybe 2 levels. A quick vital orientation for all employees and visitors who might have any contact, and then a more in-depth course, perhaps up to a week, for non-Indigenous managers who will be working closely with the community.
And on that note, language training seems incredibly valuable.
Oh, invaluable. While national languages are often used for expatriates, learning local Indigenous languages goes so much further. It demonstrates profound respect and fosters a much deeper level of understanding and trust.
Makes sense.
And here's a neat detail from the source. Sometimes reverse cultural awareness training can be beneficial too. For instance, teaching local Thai employees about Western attitudes and communication styles at a gold mine helped improve mutual understanding.
That's smart. It's a two-way street.
Absolutely. Ultimately, all of this culminates in building the right team. Companies must critically assess whether their key employees possess genuine empathy and cultural sensitivity.
And it's not.
If there's any risk of an exclusionary or confrontational approach emerging from certain personnel, it's a clear signal to stop, pause, and either reselect or reprepare your team before proceeding. The wrong people can do immense damage.
Assuming that genuine cultural awareness and commitment are in place, what does our material offer as the elements of the right approach a comprehensive blueprint for effective engagement?
Okay, the blueprint. It starts with a serious investment of time and funding to develop deep company expertise on the local communities, their customs, the social structures, the political landscape. You can't just wing it.
Do your homework.
Thoroughly. You need to proactively investigate potential conflicting objectives, say, between local community members and higher-level representatives like land councils or even government bodies.
Internal community politics.
Exactly. And then work diligently to manage those conflicts by involving all tiers of stakeholders. You can't ignore those internal dynamics.
It's also absolutely crucial, the source says, to understand each community's unique historical perspective, especially regarding their past interactions, often negative with governments and non-Indigenous society.
That history shapes everything, and this might be the most vital point operationally. Ensure you have a single, senior, authoritative, and consistent lead representative for the company throughout the entire process.
One key person. Why is consistency so important?
Because trust is built with individuals over time. Constant changes in company personnel undermine that trust. This person must also avoid overstating benefits or inadvertently creating unrealistic expectations. That backfires badly.
Under-promise and over-deliver, perhaps.
Essentially, yes. And every single commitment made must be thoroughly thought out and critically met. Broken promises are poison to the relationship.
What else is key in this blueprint?
Develop clear, consistent communication protocols. Fundamentally respect traditions and culture, acknowledging differences. Initiate honest, open dialogue as early as humanly possible. Don't wait until plans are fixed.
Be upfront from the start.
Absolutely. Dealing with honesty and integrity, building trust through ongoing dialogue, and engaging all stakeholder groups, including relevant NGOs and aid agencies, don't shut them out, is non-negotiable.
Okay.
And of course, the company must accept responsibility for its impacts, minimize them wherever possible, and provide truly justified compensation for any unavoidable changes or losses.
And finally,
assisting in community development programs should be done strictly in accordance with community wishes, not imposing what the company thinks is best. And a strong commitment must be made to employing, training, and educating Indigenous peoples locally whenever possible. That's a truly comprehensive approach that goes far beyond mere legal compliance.
it sounds like it. So let's talk about rights and responsibilities, which are truly the bedrock for ethical engagement. Beyond universal human rights, Indigenous peoples are protected by a growing body of specific international and national laws.
Yes, and what's truly illuminating here from the source material is that many early statements of rights, even from respected sources like the Brundtland Report back in the day, were often quite Western-centric in their framing.
That's so.
They could, perhaps unintentionally, end up protecting non-Indigenous interests or perspectives more than truly empowering Indigenous ones based on their own worldview.
So Indigenous peoples might reject those.
Understandably, yes. Indigenous peoples and their advocates will, quite rightly, reject statements of rights that don't genuinely stem from their own perspectives and aspirations. Authenticity is key.
This is where influential NGOs like Amnesty International, Cultural Survival, and Oxfam often step in, right? They act as advocates.
They do. They're often well-organized, highly informed, and respected advocates, acting as crucial counterbalances to potential government or corporate biases.
But the source adds a caveat.
Yes. It notes that sometimes, in their zeal to protect Indigenous peoples, some NGOs may occasionally exaggerate problems or repeat allegations without fully verifying them, which can complicate already sensitive situations. It's something companies need to navigate.
And speaking of complications, the modern world changes things. Rapid communication.
Oh, completely. Email, the internet. It means that local disputes can quickly escalate into international protests or campaigns. Companies must be acutely aware that a local disagreement can become a global PR nightmare in real time.
That global interconnectedness changes the game, and our material maps out a clear evolution in international declarations regarding Indigenous rights. How have these frameworks shifted over time?
It's a remarkable progression, really. Think about ILO Convention 107 from way back in 1957. It was quite assimilationist in its approach.
Trying to make everyone the same.
Pretty much, trying to absorb Indigenous cultures into the dominant society. By the 1980s, that approach was widely seen as unacceptable, paternalistic, even damaging.
So things changed.
Yes, leading to the revised ILO Convention 169, which was a step forward. And then the big one, in 2007, the UN General Assembly passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRP.
UNDRP, I've heard of that.
It explicitly rejects assimilation and recognizes fundamental rights, including the right not to be dispossessed of their lands without consent. It was a true game changer in international norms.
That truly sounds like a paradigm shift. So what are some of the absolute key rights enshrined in things like UNDRP that we need to understand? Starting with self-determination.
Self-determination is core. It's the right for Indigenous peoples to protect their traditional ways of life, to determine their own political status, and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development.
It implies a form of sovereignty.
At its heart, yes, even if nation-states impose practical constraints. This also entails a right of appeal to international bodies like the UN Human Rights Committee if their rights are violated.
Okay, what else?
Then there are intellectual property rights over their traditional knowledge.
Like medicinal plants.
Exactly. Traditional knowledge of natural resources, their medicinal values, their role in ecosystems is immensely valuable, and it rightfully belongs to its traditional holders. Companies can't just take it.
Right.
And critically, Indigenous peoples have the right to control and manage their local resources, which is essential to maintaining their culture and way of life. You can't separate the two.
And the preservation of cultural traditions and languages, our sources call language the most critical aspect of culture.
It truly is. Without their language, a culture struggles to maintain its unique identity and pass down its knowledge. It's the vessel of culture.
What about land rights and compensation?
A vital right is fair compensation for the removal of rights to access or use their land, particularly when land is acquired for a wider societal benefit, like a mine or dam. Legislative frameworks in places like Australia and the Philippines now legally compel serious consideration of Indigenous peoples' rights in these situations.
It's becoming legally embedded.
Increasingly, and like any group, Indigenous peoples have an undisputed right to pursue betterment and prosperity, especially if their livelihoods are affected by a project, and crucially, to be substantially involved in and determine the content of any community development programs intended to benefit them. No top-down imposition.
Our material also highlights free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. It sounds like a truly critical right, maybe a cornerstone of modern engagement. Can you break down what that really means for communities?
FPIC is indeed a cornerstone articulated in UNDIIP and now embedded in standards like the IFC's Performance Standard 7. Think of it like this.
Okay.
It's not just about getting a yes from the community leadership. The free part means it's given freely, without any coercion, intimidation, or manipulation.
No pressure.
Right. Prior means it happens before any project activities begin or key decisions are made that affect them, not after the fact.
Before shovels hit the ground.
Absolutely. Informed means they have access to all the relevant information they need to make a decision, clear, accurate, objective information about potential impacts, both positive and negative, in a language and format they understand.
Fully informed.
And consent refers to the collective agreement or support of the affected Indigenous peoples, arrived at through their own customary decision-making processes.
Does it mean everyone has to agree? Unanimity.
Not necessarily. The standards clarify it doesn't require unanimity. It refers to the collective support of the community's decision-making bodies reached through legitimate processes, even if some individuals or groups might still object. It's about genuine collective self-determination, not just a simple vote count.
That's a powerful shift in the balance of power, moving away from just consultation to actual consent in certain circumstances.
It is. It's a significant evolution.
So, with these rights firmly established, what are the core responsibilities of mining companies? Our sources lay out 10 general principles. If you had to pick one overarching principle that truly encapsulates the biggest shift for companies, what would it be?
That's a tough choice, but if I had to pick one, it's probably the 10th principle mentioned. Do not deliberately attempt to determine the future, fate, choices, or preferences of an Indigenous community.
Why that one?
Because it represents a monumental shift away from historical paternalism, the idea that the company or outsiders know best. It moves towards genuine partnership, recognizing that companies are not there to fix or manage an Indigenous community's life or tell them how to live. They are there to support the community's own self-determined aspirations. That principle is foundational to ethical engagement.
That's a profound shift in mindset. And beyond that, what are the other crucial responsibilities for companies to uphold, according to the source?
The others are just as vital. Respecting Indigenous peoples and their cultural traditions is paramount, dealing openly and honestly at all times, understanding cultural differences, and making genuine allowances for them.
Not just paying lip service.
No, truly understanding and adapting. Helping to protect and retain Indigenous communities and their traditional ways, if that is the community's wish, that last part is crucial.
Their choice.
Always their choice. Companies must ensure effective, ongoing, and truly accessible communication throughout the entire project life cycle, exploration, construction, operation, closure.
All the way through.
Yes. They need to minimize adverse impacts on both the community and the environment through meticulous pre-planning and careful operation. And crucially, only appropriately qualified and senior people should represent the company, ensuring continuity and authority, as we discussed.
Right, that consistency point again.
And finally, companies should fund and facilitate community development programs if desired by the community, assist communities in understanding the complexities of the operations, allowing ample time for comment and input, and avoid generating unrealistic expectations, always making sure to meet all commitments. It's a comprehensive package of responsibilities.
What companies are not responsible for is equally important, isn't it? Particularly in remote areas. The source emphasizes they are not governments.
This is such a problematic issue that comes up repeatedly in practice. In remote regions, companies often find themselves stepping in and filling what are essentially government roles, building schools, clinics, providing power, water.
Which seems like a good thing.
It seems helpful, and often is in the short term. But it can create unsustainable dependency. The community becomes reliant on the company for basic services.
And then the company leaves.
Exactly. When the mine closes, those services often disappear, leaving a huge vacuum. Companies must recognize this potential problem early, work proactively with local, regional, and national governments to ensure they fulfill their responsibilities, and avoid providing facilities that cannot be sustained long-term after the mine is gone.
That requires foresight. And companies should also be cautious about government investment incentive packages, the source warns.
Absolutely. Some government packages designed to attract investment might offer things like guaranteed access to land or resources that could directly conflict with Indigenous peoples' rights or prior agreements.
The potential trap.
Definitely. Companies must meticulously assess these risks up front and proactively seek advice from international organizations like the UN or ILO and relevant NGOs who understand the local context and rights situation.
And beyond ethical considerations, the source notes it's also in the company's profound self-interest to self-regulate its impacts on Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. Failure to do so, ignoring rights, or causing harm inevitably leads to international criticism, campaigns by activists, potential legal challenges, and severe adverse effects on shareholder relations and company reputation. Bad practice is bad business in the long run.
So when all these best practices are applied, when companies truly embrace these rights and responsibilities, what does true success look like? What are the desired outcomes of this kind of ethical engagement? What's the vision?
The ideal outcomes are multifaceted. First, Indigenous communities remain intact and cohesive, if that is their desire. Any changes they experience are largely determined by the communities themselves, not imposed from outside.
Self-determination in practice.
Exactly. Throughout the project's life, there should be constant, open dialogue, minimal misunderstandings, and profound mutual respect between the company and the community.
And looking at the long-term impact after the mine.
Local Indigenous communities should receive tangible, sustained benefits that continue even after the mine closes. Natural resources and important land areas should remain intact, accessible, and ecologically sustainable for future generations.
What about compensation and knowledge?
There should be appropriate, agreed-upon compensation for any unavoidable losses or impacts. Crucially, benefits, whether financial or otherwise, should be widely dispersed throughout affected communities, not just concentrated in the hands of a few, which can cause conflict. And this is often overlooked. Any knowledge gained by the company from traditional Indigenous knowledge of the environment should be genuinely acknowledged and rewarded, perhaps through benefit-sharing agreements.
And what about people's skills and future?
Robust education, training, and employment schemes should be established and sustained, leading to real careers, not just temporary jobs. After the mine, there should be carefully planned replacement regional development programs and continued government services. The goal is ensuring Indigenous workers are left with truly useful, transferable skills that empower them for future endeavors, not left high and dry.
This level of long-term vision really points to organizational responsibility. Our material argues strongly that accountability for Indigenous peoples' issues should be placed at the highest possible level within the company's CEO or senior director, mirroring how environmental management has been elevated over the years. Why is that so crucial?
It's crucial for several reasons. High-level responsibility ensures direct access for Indigenous communities to top decision-makers, which itself infers the company's profound respect for them and their issues.
Signals importance.
Exactly. It also provides continuity, ideally with the same senior person overseeing the relationship over many years, building that personal trust. This high-level involvement also allows the company to engage effectively with broader international debates and standards on Indigenous rights.
But it's not just one person's job.
No, absolutely not. While high-level oversight is key, the source stresses that cultivating good relations is ultimately the responsibility of the entire workforce, from the top management down to every employee and contractor on site. It needs to be embedded in the company culture.
This all beautifully flows into the idea of partnering for the long term, truly focusing on autonomy, meticulous preparation, and even planning for closure right from the start. How can companies truly help preserve or even restore autonomy for Indigenous peoples they work with?
It depends on the starting point. For societies that are already largely autonomous, companies should consciously seek to strengthen that existing autonomy. By consistently communicating through established Indigenous leaders, genuinely seeking their input and consent on decisions that affect them, and consciously avoiding any actions that might disrupt their society or inadvertently weaken their traditional values or governance structures.
And for societies that are already dependent, maybe due to past policies.
For those communities, a mining project can, perhaps surprisingly, be a unique opportunity to actually lessen that dependency over time.
Really? How could mining reduce dependency?
Companies can assist with capacity building, providing access to independent technical, legal, and financial advice or training, helping the community strengthen its own ability to manage its affairs and negotiate effectively.
But there's a risk there too.
Yes, the source warns companies must rigorously avoid the pitfall of transferring authority from Indigenous leaders to external advisors, even well-meaning ones. That just creates a new form of dependency on consultants. The goal is community empowerment.
And our material distills the essential ethical values and attitudes that underpin all of this successful engagement with a higher principle. What does that stand for again?
HIRE stands for honesty, integrity, respect, deep respect for individuals, customs, rituals, and equity fairness to all stakeholders involved.
Honesty, integrity, respect, equity, higher.
Exactly. These values, when consistently applied at every level of the organization, from the boardroom to the field, are what ensure effective and ethical practice.
And companies need to enforce this.
Yes, the source suggests companies should actively screen for prejudice among potential employees who will interact with communities and, if necessary, dismiss or transfer prejudiced employees. They also need to work diligently to minimize problems in multi-ethnic countries where ruling elites might harbor antipathy towards minority Indigenous groups. That adds another layer of complexity.
So communication, relationships, and building trust are clearly foundational. But the risks of miscommunication must be incredibly high, given all the differences in language, cultural values, ways of perceiving the world.
They absolutely are. It's a constant challenge. That's where skilled, trusted interpreters become absolutely essential. You can't rely on guesswork or assumptions.
What else helps bridge that gap?
Visual aids are invaluable, according to the source. Things like aerial photographs, ground-level images, even computer-modified visuals can help convey complex concepts like the scale of a large excavation or the visual impact of facilities. These aids help Indigenous communities truly grasp the potential impacts in a way words alone might not.
Makes sense. Seeing is understanding.
And remember, relationships are ultimately built between individuals, not just between abstract organizations. So they require multiple meetings over a considerable time. It's not a one-off thing. And continuity of key staff is vital.
The consistency point again.
Yes. For example, the source highlights transition sensitivity. When a project moves from exploration phase to construction phase, new company faces might suddenly appear. This needs careful handling, proper introductions, and overlap to avoid causing dismay or eroding the trust built by the exploration team.
Good point. And Indigenous peoples' participation in decision-making is vital, right? From legal requirements for consultation or consent to voluntary engagement in planning, design, and even closure plans.
Absolutely central.
This brings us to a major strategic choice outlined in our material: insulation versus integration. What are those two basic approaches to managing the interaction between the workforce and the community?
Okay, insulation basically means minimizing contact. Think fly-out workers housed in self-contained barracks, importing most goods and services, restricted access to local areas.
Creating a bubble.
Pretty much. This approach is generally considered better for shorter projects, say 5 years or less, where the goal is to minimize disruption to a traditional community.
And integration.
Integration is the opposite. Maximizing local recruitment and training, creating open towns where workers and families live alongside the community, sharing utilities like power and water, sourcing local goods and services.
More embedded in the community.
Exactly. This is usually seen as better for longer projects, maybe 20 years or more, as it allows for genuine local capacity building, skills transfer, and economic development that might last beyond the mine.
And the choice between them.
The source stresses that the ultimate decision between these two approaches will profoundly impact the indigenous community, and it must align with their wishes and aspirations. It's their community, their future.
And companies should also be prepared to implement those workforce codes of conduct we discussed earlier if requested by the community.
Yes, definitely. Things like restricting access to settlements or sacred sites, or having clear rules on alcohol and drugs. It shows respect for community norms.
When it comes to how Indigenous peoples can be actively involved in the operations, not just consulted, our sources detail 5 main options. What are they?
Right, beyond just jobs, they can potentially be equity partners having a financial stake, beneficiaries through trusts or foundations receiving royalties, joint venturers actively partnering in the business, contractors providing specific services to the mine, and employees working directly for the company. Lots of models are possible.
It's fascinating to see how these relationships have evolved over time, as highlighted by a case study from Australia in the source material. It outlines 3 distinct generations of engagement.
Yes, it's a really useful framework. The first generation, maybe decades ago, involved just basic legal compliance, paying royalties, but very little active Indigenous involvement in the project itself, kind of passive recipients.
Okay, generation 1.
Second generation moved to more complex land use agreements and enterprise agreements, often negotiated through representative bodies like land councils. Still somewhat limited active involvement in operations, though this model was sometimes preferred by Indigenous groups wanting less direct engagement.
And the third generation.
The third generation, which represents current best practice, involves truly negotiated agreements involving multiple stakeholders. The focus is on active participation in operations, procurement, and building sustainable economic independence for the community beyond the life of the mine. It's a much more integrated partnership model.
Building on that, capacity building is absolutely crucial. The source points out that many Indigenous communities simply lack the specific negotiation skills or technical knowledge needed to engage effectively on a level playing field with large, experienced mining corporations.
It's a huge power imbalance often, and companies actually have a vested interest in helping to level that field somewhat.
How so?
By providing arm's-length assistance, maybe funding independent advisors chosen by the community, or helping communities strengthen their own internal organization and leadership and access critical information. This ensures a more robust, equitable, and ultimately more stable negotiation process and agreement.
And when it comes to recruiting and training programs specifically for Indigenous peoples, these need very specific considerations to be truly effective, don't they? What are some of those critical factors?
Yes, you can't just use standard HR practices. Flexibility is paramount. Programs need to accommodate traditional cultural responsibilities and family obligations. For instance, one project cited used a 4 days on, 4 days off roster to allow people time back in their communities.
That makes sense. What else?
Training must recognize potentially limited prior formal education or industrial experience, so programs need to be tailored, maybe different streams for job-ready, semi-skilled, and unskilled individuals.
Tailored training.
Yes. Programs should ideally be incentive-based, structured according to community capacity and aspirations, not just company needs, and negotiated as part of long-term agreements. Consistency across all company divisions and, importantly, contractors is vital. Everyone needs to be on the same page.
What about career progression?
There should be a clear pathway for staged progression towards supervisory or management roles, economic independence, maybe even self-employment through contracting opportunities. Mentors are also key, pairing experienced workers with new Indigenous employees to enhance retention and development.
And a key warning from the source.
Crucially, companies must avoid the trap of restricting Indigenous peoples to low-skill, low-paying jobs like gardening, cleaning, or basic laboring. This inevitably causes resentment and waste potential. Instead, implement robust job readiness programs before operations even begin to train individuals for higher-paying, more skilled occupations. Invest upfront in human capital.
Moving into the practicalities of project preparation, our sources strongly advocate for undertaking anthropological surveys as a best practice. Why so early?
They should be undertaken very early in the exploration or feasibility stage. They provide invaluable insights into social structures, cultural practices, land use patterns, potential impacts. They give you crucial baseline data against which to measure change, and they inform sensitive social planning.
What do they involve?
Usually a mix of methods: questionnaires, direct observation, interviews with elders and community members, group discussions. They're often coordinated with socioeconomic and archaeological studies. And it's important, the source notes, to understand that the survey process itself can influence community attitudes, so it needs to be conducted with profound sensitivity and transparency.
And identifying all the relevant stakeholders is crucial, though the source admits this is often incredibly difficult, especially where land tenure is complex or contested.
Oh, absolutely. Think of places like Papua New Guinea, with potentially thousands of small, overlapping customary landholdings. It's a huge challenge. It needs to be initiated very early and understood as an ongoing process, not a one-time task.
Who are stakeholders beyond traditional owners?
You must include downstream communities who might be affected by water impacts, other non-indigenous land users like pastoralists or tourism operators, perhaps recent migrant groups. The list can be long and complex, and it evolves as the project develops and brings in new people.
Informing all these stakeholders accurately is paramount, the source says, to avoid rumors, misinformation, and unwelcome surprises down the track.
Yes, proactive communication is key. Methods can include things like one-on-one briefings with key leaders, utilizing trusted community representatives or liaisons, and maybe forming formal community liaison groups.
Liaison groups.
Yeah, where the company provides support, but the members are selected by the stakeholders themselves to represent their interests. Crucially, the information shared must be honest, explaining the potential downside of mining, the warts and all, and rigorously avoiding exaggerating benefits or making unrealistic promises.
And mine visits.
Organized mine visits for community representatives can also be incredibly helpful in building understanding of what the operation actually involves, demystifying it.
Negotiations themselves, of course, require that deep trust and understanding we keep coming back to. How should companies approach them?
Companies should clearly identify their own aspirations and, importantly, what they might be willing to trade or compromise on. They also need to try and anticipate indigenous aspirations based on prior engagement.
Is a structured approach better?
The source suggests a clearly defined framework for negotiation, it even provides examples, is often better than a completely open-ended discussion as it provides clarity. But flexibility is still essential, because community expectations may legitimately change over the long life of a mine. You need a process to revisit things. And remember, governments are usually involved too, with their own political and institutional interests that complicate the negotiations.
And on compensation specifically, beyond minimum legal requirements, companies should aim to pay fair compensation for the right to mine, any loss of amenity, like noise or dust, and any unavoidable damage.
Yes, and the discussion needs to cover the form of compensation: cash, infrastructure, services, who the recipients should be, individuals, families, community trusts, and the schedule of payments.
And the risks of cash again.
Yes, the source reiterates the risks of large lump sum cash payments in non-cash economies. Progressive payments, like ongoing royalties linked to production, are often better as they provide a steady income stream and are less disruptive. Many companies also find they need to contribute to community projects beyond formal compensation agreements, just as part of being a good neighbor.
Using foundations or NGOs.
That can be a good model.
Yeah.
Having foundations or trusted NGOs manage discretionary community development funds can provide an arm's-length disbursement process, build local management capacity, and often attract additional funding from other donors.
And addressing social change. Our material points out that changes are inevitable with a big project, but mining simply accelerates them dramatically.
Yeah.
So impact assessments are vital.
Yes, to identify potential changes, positive and negative, and plan mitigation strategies before they happen.
And community input is key here.
Absolutely critical. Communities must be fully informed of potential impacts before they occur so they can participate meaningfully in deciding how to manage them. Establishing ongoing consultative mechanisms, like that community liaison group model, is key for dealing with emerging issues that weren't anticipated.
How do you track cultural impacts?
That's harder than tracking jobs or income. While socioeconomic statistics are useful, monitoring cultural impacts often requires long-term anthropological surveys, perhaps conducted periodically over many years, even generations, to truly understand the deeper shifts.
Okay, so as the mine moves into operation and eventually plans for closure, monitoring the effectiveness of all these initiatives is crucial. What specifically can be tracked to see if the relationship and programs are working?
You can track practical things, like the effectiveness of training programs. Are people getting skills?
Right.
Workforce participation rates? Are local people being employed and retained, especially Indigenous people? community health indicators, and the tangible outcomes of community development programs.
What about attitudes?
Socioeconomic statistics like crime rates, school attendance, and income levels are useful quantitative measures. And regular, carefully designed community attitude surveys can provide direct qualitative feedback on how people feel the relationship is going and whether impacts are being managed well.
And preparing for mine closure. This sounds like it carries significant potential for adverse social effects if not handled properly.
Oh, hugely. Think about it. Mass unemployment as the mine winds down, a sudden loss of income for families and local businesses, potentially redundant skills, radically changed lifestyles if traditional practices were abandoned. It can devastate communities if not planned for well in advance.
So planning needs to start early.
Absolutely. The source stresses planning must happen well before closure occurs, not as an afterthought. It highlights 3 critical requirements for responsible closure in this context.
Okay, what other?
First, land rehabilitation to a form that is physically safe and, crucially, environmentally and culturally acceptable to the traditional owners. They have to live with it afterwards.
Makes sense.
Second, trying to ensure the continuation of some form of income stream for the community. This might come from the prudent investment of funds generated during the mine's operation, perhaps managed by a community foundation.
And
Third, the proactive development of alternative, sustainable livelihoods that can replace the mine-based economy. This needs active support long before closure.
and who drives this closure planning?
The direction for this mitigation, for what the post-mining future should look like, should ideally come from the community itself, with appropriate government oversight and support.
What's the company's role then?
The company's role is to assist, provide realistic predictions about closure impacts, share information, and provide resources to support the community's planning. And crucially, if Indigenous peoples have been involved in supervisory or management roles during operations or have formed their own contracting businesses supplying the mine.
They're better equipped for the future.
Exactly. They are much better equipped to pursue post-closure ventures and lead their community's transition. Ultimately, the source concludes, the company must share responsibility with the community and government to establish sustainable socioeconomic infrastructure robust enough to avoid collapse after the mine is gone.
And bonds aren't enough.
Financial guarantees or bonds posted for environmental cleanup are important, but they are not a substitute for the continued involvement by a committed company in managing the social transition. And underpinning all of this, the source notes, is project profitability. A mine needs to be financially successful to afford effective long-term environmental and social management, including closure.
What an incredible complex journey we've taken today, bringing it all back to the core message of this deep dive based on Spitz and Trudiner. Mining is not necessarily incompatible with the values and aspirations of Indigenous peoples.
No, definitely not inherently incompatible. On the contrary, when approached with genuine respect, deep understanding, and unwavering commitment, it can provide truly unique opportunities for societies to regain independence, build capacity, and achieve greater self-reliance, charting their own course for the future.
And it underscores so powerfully that Indigenous peoples have the fundamental right to decide whether and under what specific conditions mining takes place on their traditional land. They have the right to be fairly compensated for impacts and, crucially, to genuinely benefit from the use of their resources.
And ultimately, we need to remember, Indigenous peoples will likely reoccupy and continue to live on the land long after mining operations cease. The profound challenge and responsibility for the mining industry is to plan, operate, and finally close its projects in a way that is understood by, acceptable to, actively involves, and genuinely benefits the community in a collective sense, not just throughout the project's operational life, but robustly beyond it into the future.
Which leaves us with this powerful, thought-provoking question for you, our listeners. In a world where land is both a finite resource for extraction and, for many Indigenous peoples, a sacred mother, a source of identity in life itself, what does truly sustainable development actually look like in that context? How can we as a global society, as industries, as individuals, ensure that the benefits of progress genuinely empower communities and strengthen their resilience, rather than inadvertently creating new forms of vulnerability and dependence for generations to come?